This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is George Harrell. George is a high school humanities teacher with Kepler Education, an online Christian education program, and is the executive director of the Buchanan Forum, an organization promoting the relationship between liberty and theology. We will be talking about education, biblical literacy, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, and much more. George, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you so much. It's really great to get to talk to you. I really appreciate the work that you've done. Enjoyed listening to your podcast for some time.
Well, I really appreciate it, and I'm excited to have you on. We actually got in contact about doing this, I think, back in like April, but just because of scheduling reasons, couldn't make it work. So I'm excited that we're finally getting to it, even though it's the end of the summer. Before we start, just tell us a little about yourself.
Yeah, well, so as you mentioned in the intro there, I'm an educator. I've been teaching high school humanities courses for about 10 years now. Love doing that. That's something that I've really enjoyed doing. Currently doing that now with Kepler Education. So it's online. And that is a broadly Christian classical platform. And then I also work with the George Buchanan Forum here in Moscow, Idaho.
That's awesome. Well, I wanted to talk about Kepler Education for a little bit because, as everyone in my audience knows, I am a public school teacher, which is really the reason why I'm such a hardcore libertarian right now after seeing all of the corruption and everything that happens in the school system. It was very easy for me to draw the conclusions. And once I started reading Rothbard, it just all made sense. So talk to us about what you do with that. So it's an online Christian-based program. How did you get involved? What kind of programs do you offer your kids? How does it all work?
Yeah, so like I said, it's online, and I function there as an independent teacher. So one of the things that I've really enjoyed about the Kepler Education platform is that there's a lot of freedom, both for the teacher and for the student, which is something I've really appreciated. So there's freedom on my end as far as the courses that I offer, proposing new courses, and then also how I then teach those courses. And so I don't have somebody breathing over my neck, over my shoulder, trying to make sure that I'm following a particular curriculum for that course. And then it also, the way they have it set up, offers a lot of freedom for the students and for the parents. So it can be used either to just supplement courses that parents are thinking, well, I would like to have my kid be able to brush up on literature or mathematics or something like that. I don't feel comfortable teaching that. So maybe if I could get him enrolled in a course, that would be helpful. And so it could be utilized that way. It also is not really intensive as far as the class time is concerned. So there's a little, there's homework throughout the week, but then usually it meets about once a week to kind of then interact with the material that's being studied. And then also, if you choose, you can then go through the actual diploma course that they offer and pursue that if you'd like. So there's a lot of freedom, like I said, both for the teachers and for the parents.
That's really cool, and it sounds like it gives you as an academic, like a teacher, a lot of flexibility in the way that you like teach your courses and things like that. So, would you say like the majority of your kids are homeschoolers, or how do you guys find students for the program?
Yeah, so. A lot of the students are homeschooled, or they're people who are moving out of government-sponsored education, and especially after 2020, there was a big rise in that. And so students saying, okay, parents wanting more control over what's being taught to their kids or more in-home time. So there's various reasons why they might be moving towards a platform like that. But for the most part, they're either in a private school and they're looking to supplement, or they're in a homeschool situation. And they're either, like I said, following the diploma track or just wanting to supplement some additional courses.
Yeah, that's really cool. So like your day-to-day as a teacher working for Kepler, what does that look like? Is it grading papers? Is it preparing lesson materials? Like what is your job like being in that environment?
Yeah, there's excuse me, there's a lot of interaction either with the students preparing homework, because I don't use usually a actual curriculum. That's all being developed by me. And especially because of that, or I don't know if necessarily I should say especially, and I would be interested to hear from your perspective how this has been in your case. Um, there's always the sense of, well, it's never done. And
Right.
I'm always
Yes.
trying to figure out, how can this be improved? How can I fine tune this? How can I make sure that the time that I'm spending with the students or the time that they're spending away from the classroom is being utilized towards the ends that that they're getting the material that I really want them to get out of the course. And that always is requiring more and more work, more thought on my part. And then also just thinking up new courses that I would like to participate in or teach, but and then preparation for class time.
Yeah, no, that's really cool, and that is one of the disadvantages of the public schools. So I teach seventh grade social studies, and it's basically world civilization during the Middle Ages, and so we have a particular set of state standards that we have to teach every single year, and we've divided up our course into 9 separate units. And with our district, we have like a curriculum map that we have to stick to, and we have certain times when we have to assess certain units. So we don't really have any additional time to teach these concepts if we don't get to them in class. So like on the one hand, it does help keep teachers that are very distracted on a particular path, because I think there are a lot of people out there that really need that. But on the other hand, it can kind of handicap us a little bit. And we're in the position where, me and my content partner, where we've been doing this for long enough, we have all of our resources, and every year we can kind of refine our resources and see what we need. But we're locked into what we are required to teach by the state. So we don't have quite as much flexibility to adapt instruction. And of course, I think one of the advantages of being a part of a program like Kepler is that in general, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but in general, the kind of students that you're receiving into your program are students that want to learn. Whereas in my situation, I have 30 12-year-olds in my class. Some of them could be taking college level courses and being successful, and some of them can't read. And so how do you teach this content to a group of students that is that diverse? It's almost impossible to do. I would imagine you don't have those kind of hangups with a program like Kepler, right?
Yeah, not quite to that extent, definitely. You do have the like one of the drawbacks on something like this is because sometimes people are supplementing and they're just kind of dipping in or out of taking this course, taking that course. There's not necessarily an assumed level of knowledge across the student body. So you do occasionally run into that where it's kind of like, okay, can I expect them to write at the same, to have gone through the same writing levels? What can I expect from them writing essays or their reading capabilities? But you are right that by and large, I would say easily over 95% of the students are quite self-motivated. And that's fantastic to actually get to teach kids like that. And it's, at the end of every year, every school year, it's definitely quite bittersweet getting to say goodbye to these people who you've been working with them for a full year. And because you've seen that self-motivation, that desire to learn on their part, there emerges a real camaraderie that's just fantastic.
Yeah, that is a really cool experience to have. So, were you ever a public school teacher before, or how did you get an education to begin with?
No, I was never involved with public education. So I went basically straight from getting a master's degree to eventually going on and teaching online.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's awesome. So you never had to go through the crucible of being in the public schools. That does kind of put you at an advantage in a lot of respects. From someone who's always been on the outside in alternative education, what, in your opinion, are the greatest problems that we're facing in the public schools today? And I'm sure you hear from a lot of your students' parents why they were disaffected about the school system. Like, what's your read on the issues with American public schools?
Yeah, and obviously I'm coming at it from an outsider. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this as being somebody actually involved in from the inside. One of the things that parents definitely are concerned about is about the culture and and there being a divide between the culture that they're wanting to impart to their students and the culture that their students are picking up from the education, the students around them, from the teachers. One of the things that I think our education system does, I don't know if I want to say does well, but it's building off of, I think, the incentive structure of the machinery that we exist in.
Yeah.
It's like our culture or the machinery of the state, where it's saying these are the incentives that we want to give people when they go out to try to get an education. Because obviously it's very, our educational system is based on, where do you want to go after you graduate from high school? You want to go into college? Okay. It's goal oriented towards your job. And it's therefore orienting, I think it's the students in our culture today towards being producers and consumers, or rather data collectors, or people who are being designed to be collected for their data. And I think that's the system of incentives that have been built into our educational system today. These are the type of people that we want at the end of this. How can we get that? And it's not necessarily because I think that there's a single hive mind, but it's just, when we're being motivated, we're being incentivized, we're looking to the authority, to people that are authorities, that speak with authority into our lives, and that will reward us, give us meaning in our lives. And we're like, okay, so here's the state, here's the machinery around us. So much of our culture is based off of the material accumulation of goods. And it's like, okay, well, how can I acquire that?
I definitely agree with that analysis. And I think because we're both good free marketers, we understand how incentive theory works. And I think one of the problems with public education, especially over the last 40 years or so, has been the trend towards more centralized control over the public education system. So instead of local school districts and states making decisions about curriculum and graduation requirements and school culture and discipline and things like that, a lot of those decisions are made from the federal government, and a large amount of money is attached to states that choose to comply with those federal benchmarks. And I really do believe that No Child Left Behind in 2002 was the major turning point in the American education system moving towards a more centralized process. And like you were saying before, it creates, I think, for education bureaucrats, a set of particular incentives that have very little to do. So I agree with you completely. Rhetorically, the goals of public schools, and we say this in our district all the time, is to make our students college and career ready, which I think is a noble and admirable goal for education. That should be the reason why you go and get an education, is that so you can have a preparedness for either higher ed or to go and get a career. But instead of actually helping students have the knowledge base they need to be successful when they graduate, what the public school system has done is it's created a lot of these bureaucratic incentives to make sure that states are performing very well on common assessments at the end of each school year. And so all of instruction has basically been designed to help make sure that kids perform well on the end of year test, which actually makes it impossible for them to get a quality, well-rounded education. And I think that that's really unfortunate. And I tell my students this all the time, that in terms of discipline, like, there are unfortunately a lot of people within the education bureaucracy that come from that leftist egalitarian worldview, where they don't believe that students should be disciplined for bad behavior, and they believe in restorative practices and things like that. And what that's created environmentally in our schools, and you alluded to the environmental problems earlier, is that kids can get away with doing pretty much anything they want without there ever being any real consequences. Like, we don't really expel kids anymore. And if a student comes into school and they like hit a teacher, or they hit another kid, or they cuss someone out in the hallway, or they draw graffiti all over the bathroom, like, there's no like final punishment for that. They might get put in in-school suspension, or they might have to go to a restorative circle or something like that, but there's no consequences, and the kids understand that. So on the one hand, they're not being given the academic and intellectual skills that they need to be successful as adults. And on the other hand, they're not learning how to like be properly socialized in a way of learning how to appropriately interact with other human beings. And it really is, like, I tell people this all the time that are outside the public school system, no matter how bad you think it is, it's actually much worse.
Oh, that's terrifying. Yeah. Yeah. And our culture, our education, we're really good at we're really interested in accumulating knowledge, but we're terrible at meaning.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And that was another thing that I wanted to talk to you about as well, because I know that one of our umbrella standards for seventh grade social studies, and this is true really for social studies at every level in the state of Kentucky, is economics. But our kids are completely economically illiterate. And I graduated high school in Kentucky in 2007 and did not take an economics class. And when I went to get my undergraduate degree in biblical studies, I didn't take an economics class. And it wasn't until I was taking prerequisite courses for my master's program when I was like 26 or 27 years old that I was first forced to take an economics class, and it completely changed the way that I looked at the world. And I know that with Kepler, you teach economics as well. So I want to talk about that for a minute. Like, what is your experience with economic illiteracy? Like, what is it about like economics that the average student just doesn't understand? And why do you think as a society we are so ignorant about that?
Yeah, and I think it gets back to that idea of us being really data driven. Right. So
Yeah.
we're really interested in accumulating data. We're really interested in accumulating truth. And I'm reminded of this quote from C.S. Lewis, where he said, "Reason is the natural organ of truth, but imagination, or I think you'd say also narrative, is the organ of meaning." And so getting back to that idea of we're not good at collecting meaning, and especially when it comes to human beings. And
Yeah.
thinking of us as humans, because we're really good at dissecting as a society, breaking the whole down into its parts, and we can do that with people. I'm thinking of a Yuval Harari TED talk that he gave years back, where he was talking about how he was saying that God, nations, and rights are all just a story that we tell, by which he then means it's a fictional fake story. And he was saying if you cut a person open, you don't find rights inside of him.
Right.
And it's like, well, it's true. But then the interesting thing is that we align ourselves in our search for meaning along these narratives. And just because they are narratives, that doesn't mean actually at the end that they are false. But why would it be wrong to cut a person open to look for his rights? Like, can we empirically analyze that and come to a conclusion about that? We won't find out by cutting the person open. So we're driven by narratives and by collecting the parts into a greater whole. And so when people are approaching economics, it seems that generally what's going on over the course of the last 100 plus years is that we're following the movement of economic resources and saying, okay, based off of that, can we predict where they're going to end up at whatever over however much time that we give it? Can we predict the future based off of the data that we have coming in, without realizing that actually what's the key component to the economy is the society, and then therefore also the people that make it up. So we've lost the humanity of society in our analysis of modern economics, and the idea that human beings are acting out of their own free will in pursuit of their own desires, whether those are good or bad. So we've completely stripped the meaning of humanity from our analysis.
Yeah. Why do you think that is the case in Western culture? Because that really is, like, within the Austrian tradition of economics, the fundamental insight is a subjective theory of value. It's the idea that human beings act to satisfy subjective preferences. And I just think that makes so much sense on as you said before, like narratival and social level. But it seems like when you look at professional economics outside of like the Austrian or Chicago school of economics, it's all just like mathematical. It's nothing but mathematical models quantifying specific data and things like that, and has almost no bearing whatsoever to like the real life choices that the average people make historically. Because you teach history as well, and I want to ask you about that in a minute too. Like, why do you think as a Western society we've just completely ignored that? Is it just our ignorance of how like narrative knowledge works, or what is it?
Yeah, I mean, we're 400 years into the scientific revolution, and some people who see the problems that I just described will have a tendency to want to deride the scientific revolution, which I don't think is necessarily helpful. I think that we've gained a lot of good things from it, but over the course of this 400-year history, I think there's been a tendency to, like I said, want to dissect reality down to its parts that we can understand it, which there's value in that. I mean, they say, okay, thanks to the scientific revolution, I can put a man on the moon, or I can
Yeah.
build a nuclear bomb. And then the meaning crisis comes in when we say, well, ought we to be doing that?
Yes.
And that's then where we have problems in the meaning crisis there. And I think it's because we have reduced everything to this mechanistic system, in part because of the success that we've had with it. But we've come to a point now where we even talk about ourselves in terms of machinery. And we talk about, we're so focused on our productivity, about our maximization. It's as though we're treating ourselves as a 19th century factory, and we've put ourselves all on a key performance indicator. And so by doing that, again, I think we've reduced us to our components without understanding how they make up a whole. And I think that nothing literally embodies this quite so much as the transgender movement. The idea of like, okay, we can remove parts of ourselves. There was, I forget her name, but there was I think it was a British philosopher who was remarking that, we treat humanity as, even just the individual as basically meat Legos. So we could reduce ourselves down to these components that we can reassemble at will, but we don't have any understanding as to why these components are together. And that's where a narrative is actually necessary in order to give it meaning. Why are these parts together? Well, ultimately, and I think this is something then that we've stripped away, or that we've lost in our mechanization, or our dissection of humanity, of society, of nature, is that we've lost the transcendent. And that's ultimately then what gives all of this meaning.
Yeah, and I wonder if there's kind of an interplay there too with the way that people in the Western world have tended to become less religious over time. Friedrich Hayek has that really great book, The Counter-Revolution of Science, where he kind of details the way in which the presuppositions of the scientific revolution were kind of illegitimately applied to the problems of human beings. And his whole argument was that, yes, the scientific revolution was designed to measure and account for a phenomenon that took place in nature. And to that extent, it was incredibly successful. But the problem is that human society doesn't operate under the same set of natural laws as the natural world does. So it's a category mistake. And he said that really it's the application of kind of the scientific way of thinking to the problems of human beings that led to socialism and ultimately the disaster of the 20th century with all the wars and everything else. And I also think there's a case to be made that with the new atheist movement, which I guess the new atheist movement's now pretty old, but there are still a lot of people that operate under that set of theological presuppositions. It's the idea that science can and should be able to solve every single problem that we have, including ethical problems, which I think is illegitimate. So would you say that might be contributing to a decline of religiosity in the West? It's just that complete disconnection of narrative knowledge from the scientific process?
Yeah, we've by breaking us down into our components, we've also lost not just the meaning that we have in our interactions in the present, but we've also lost the meaning in our interactions with the past. And so looking to the past and understanding, okay, you were talking about religion and its role in society. How has Christianity shaped Western civilization? How have people found meaning from that? Well, today we wouldn't even know where to look for that because, again, to quote C.S. Lewis, we have this historical snobbery where, well, I'm an isolated human being from the past, from the people around me. I'm just a data collector, or I'm being collected for my data. And I remember there was a quote from Mark Zuckerberg, talking about how health is improving, poverty is shrinking, knowledge is growing, people are connecting. So, how can you argue against that? But then, if we look across society, so if those are our key performance indicators, if we're putting society on a KPI to look at health or poverty or knowledge, okay, I can go to the internet and I have way more knowledge at my fingertips than I ever have before, but I'm swimming in this sea of data and feeling completely isolated. So I'm feeling meaningless. I'm feeling lost. I'm feeling isolated, despite my this new ability to connect. And to think about with the meaning crisis, we also have this, the authority crisis of, well, if we've been stripped from these middling institutions that give society meaning, things like family, the church, then what do I use to fill that vacuum? If I am just this isolated individual in this sea of data trying to find meaning, and that's then obviously where the state steps in and says, hang on, I can give you meaning. I can give you an education. I can give you a job. I can help you to accumulate the wealth that will cause you to be able to look at your neighbors and say, I'm doing well.
Yeah, man. I mean, that's a really good point. I have interacted quite a bit with a lot of the progressive Christian types on Twitter ever since I joined, because I'm just very interested in like the post evangelical progressive way of thinking about Christianity, just theologically and culturally and socially. And I really think that what you just said there speaks a lot to the experience of those people. In my opinion, I think a lot of what it is that when people jettison the traditional values and the traditional beliefs of Christianity, they lose sight of that Christian meta narrative. It's the Christian worldview that helps explain the current situation that we find ourselves in. And I think it's very easy to turn from that worldview, which is all encompassing and gives a sense of purpose and meaning and value to those of us that believe, to the state, which becomes a new sort of meta narrative that gives a purpose and meaning and value to everything that they do. And I've noticed with a lot of these progressive Christians that they transfer a lot of this theological language of justice and mercy and compassion and charity. They transfer that directly from their Christian context into this new state-oriented context. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they've disconnected themselves from that tradition. But I also think that American evangelicalism is kind of at a crossroads as well. And I know that you were talking before the show about how, you're from Idaho, and so you're in the middle of Christian nationalist country. Christian nationalism is a form of idolatrous statism. And in a lot of ways, I think if we went back to the 1980s and maybe even a little bit before that, we can see the American evangelical church making all kinds of horrible compromises with the Republican Party. And in a lot of ways, I think that they lost their soul, which meant that a whole generation of kids that were raised in that environment, it was very easy for them to step outside of kind of like that right-wing Christian statism and into a left-wing Christian statism. And I think I would agree with you. I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that we've lost our sense of story and purpose as Christians.
Yeah, and what it means to be human then. And you were asking about economics, and it's what it means to be human has been completely stripped from that analysis. And we're doing that sometimes very purposefully in our education. And I think that people in power, that is the goal, where let me step in then and be able to replace whatever narratives would have given you meaning with one that I can then, with a new myth that will then reorient you from some sort of transcendent truth towards whatever it is that I have to offer you.
Yeah, that's a really great way of putting it, and I totally agree. And it's amazing how when I was in youth ministry, I would always try to, in my lessons, make sure that I included the big picture, the big story of Scripture. So the whole idea of sin, God working through Abraham's family, Israel's failure, Jesus restoring Israel, the incorporation of the church, all of that stuff, which once you understand kind of the basics of the biblical narrative, almost everything in the Bible makes more sense. Now, it doesn't solve all of our problems. Obviously, there are a lot of exegetical questions that remain, but it does help you to grasp and kind of apprehend what's going on a big picture level. And I think that more people need that narrative. And it's funny because I'm preaching on Ephesians this Sunday, but I'm making sure that I have a 2-minute section of my sermon where I explain the story of the Old Testament, because people need to hear it, because they genuinely don't know, even if they grew up in church. And I know from talking to you beforehand that you teach biblical narrative at your school. So I kind of want to ask you some general questions about that. For your students, do you think a lot of them come into your class understanding the meta narrative of Scripture? And if they don't, how do you go about teaching that to these high school kids?
Yeah, there's the idea of meta narrative. I think that can definitely get lost. The idea of reading Scripture as story is easily lost in the weeds of theology. that happens all the time when we want to reduce an argument merely to a proof text. Say, okay, how can I analytically or didactically break down scripture into a theological argument? And usually that's being done with the goal of being able to batter somebody over the head with it.
Yes.
But then realizing, and this is kind of the reason why for me, the idea of teaching a course on biblical narrative and imagery is so important, is because the imagery within scripture has provided the foundation for the Western imagination for the last, nearly 2,000 years. And so when we were talking earlier about meaning and meaning being derived from narrative, you don't have to be a Christian in order to actually be a participant in this meaning making from the imagery in scripture. Anytime we read a narrative, we read literature and we're moved by it, the imagery that's in there is drenched with the imagery from literature that's been written over the past 2,000 years, which itself is then drawing from scripture, right? It's so, there was the joke about the person who was reading Shakespeare and said, well, it's good, but it's full of cliches. Because our literature today is seeped in Shakespeare, and our literature today, even whether we know it or not, it's shaped by the imagery in Milton, it's shaped by the imagery in Dante, and all of that literature that's been written over the past 1,500, 2,000 years is itself then shaped by this biblical imagery. And so, I was thinking about Richard Dawkins when he was talking about recently that he realized that he's a cultural Christian.
Yeah.
Right. That he is also an inheritor of this imagery, of this meaning making via story. And so if you're going to ever go out and try to read literature or make sense of narrative, you need to have the vocabulary to be able to understand it and comprehend it. If you're going to look at the symbolism hidden within it. And so having biblical literacy is necessary, is foundational in order to be able to comprehend that.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. I want to put this thesis by you, and this might be a little controversial for some of the members of my audience, but I know that if they've been listening to my podcast for this long, they kind of know my take on a lot of this stuff. I really think that a lot of this has to do with the nature of the Protestant Reformation. Now, it doesn't begin in the 16th century, but I think that the Protestant Reformation was essentially a movement that was waged over a particular set of doctrines. Now, it was about church practice as well, but these church practices, like indulgences, were embedded within a particular theological framework. And when Martin Luther made salvation by faith alone the centerpiece of the Reformation, I think that maybe he didn't necessarily mean this himself, but certainly his followers received him to have been meaning this, that what faith really is a set of certain theological propositions that one has to subscribe to, and that's what constitutes real Christianity. And so Christianity, built into the Reformation, was not about trying to reclaim the narrative of the Bible so that we could understand our place in the world. It was about trying to prove from the scriptures which doctrines were correct. And if you didn't have the correct doctrines, then you couldn't be properly labeled a Christian. And I think that's the reason why we have 3,000 denominations now. So I know that to say that like the seeds of our own like narrative demise were kind of sown with the Reformation might rub some people the wrong way. Again, I have a ton of respect for the reformers, and I think that they are operating within the framework of late medieval Catholicism, which is inherently doctrinal as well. But I don't think it's done us any favors in the modern world. So I want to ask you that. Do you think that the reason why Christians in the 21st century have such a hard time grasping the biblical narrative is because it's almost baked into the cake that what it means to be a true Christian is having this certain set of theological propositions in the Bible is just kind of like it's the source of the proof text for all of our favorite doctrines? Am I onto something there?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I think I would definitely join you on that. And obviously the end result of that today has been so much of American evangelicalism wanting to treat scripture as though it was an instruction manual for IKEA furniture.
That's a great way of putting it.
which could cause you to read the gospel narratives. You're like, okay, Jesus shows up. Okay, here he is. Okay, he's going to preach this gospel of salvation. And doggone it, why is he speaking in these riddles, wouldn't it be a whole lot easier if he just gave us a theological proof text to say, hey, these are the 5 steps that you need for salvation. Here's why I'm here. And you're like, well, actually, the whole book is written that way.
Yeah.
Why is it packaged in narrative? So if we have an omniscient God who's crafting this narrative, and he's saying, okay, what is the best way for me to reveal myself in the literal word, in written text? Well, it's via narrative. Yeah, there's a lot of question there. It's like, okay, why? How does the fact that a perfect being decided to reveal himself in narrative, that somehow narrative is the best way that he could do that? What does that mean? What are the implications of that? And then, your comment about the Reformation. If we desacramentalize the sacred and say, okay, well, these things are these physical objects, these physical goods are merely, this gets into the whole question of allegory versus symbolism. So you're reading Pilgrim's Progress, and you have allegory going on there, and you have the image and then the thing that it points to. And at the end of the day, in allegory, the image is not important. It's just the thing that it represents. So once we've comprehended the connection between the image and the thing that it represents, we can do away with the image. And so when we're reading allegory, we're trying to break it down into its parts again to figure out, okay, what does this character represent? What does this object represent? And now that I know that, I don't need to contemplate more on the narrative, which is distinct from something like symbolism. And so which says that it's like, okay, when we read good literature, it's not capable of being broken down into a 3x5 card of distilled explanation. There's this story. I think it was Flannery O'Connor. They said she was explaining that if you could summarize a book into a single sentence, into a single point, well, then there was no reason for the book to exist.
Yeah.
And yet we all realize that, okay, well, when I read narrative, when I read a book, I'm not just getting truths. Again, going back to our emphasis today is all about knowledge. How can I just suck the information from this narrative out? It's almost like a Rubik's Cube. We want to treat, and people do this all the time with symbolism today, we want to treat it like a Rubik's Cube. How can I get at the kernel of knowledge that's hidden inside there and then cast it aside? But when we read a good book and realize that, no, actually what's going on here is that it's far more complex than, it's not capable of just being broken down into its parts, that there's something that's happening when I'm reading literature. Somebody said that what we have is we've got this convergence of patterns of meaning, that when those are all occurring in literature, we're moved. We're empathetically brought along with these characters, and we're able to see the world through another person's eyes, and that's what's happening in good literature. And so when we do that with, I think, created reality, treat it like an allegory. And like, okay, well, it's just a symbol, or not a symbol, but it's just an image of something else. And ultimately, I can do away with the image once I understand what it points me to. We can lose the redemptive aspects of creation through that. And that has all sorts of implication towards, narrative. You're like, well, why can't modern American evangelicals write good fiction or make good movies?
Yeah, that's a great point. I never thought about it like that, but you're absolutely right. That's it.
Yeah, we can't appreciate these things for their own sake, because if we're seeing them symbolically rather than allegorically, then it's saying, okay, I look at any number of things around me in creation, and I say, okay, here's this object, here's a tree, here are grapes, here's a book, and it points me towards something in the eternal, points me towards that. And so I'm able to get a glimpse of the eternal through the present reality. And then through that glimpse, it then informs me as to how that thing is going to then be redeemed ultimately. And so there's some sort of sacredness within the items and the objects around us, including even nature. And I think this is one of the reasons why we'll also have people react so strongly to, to environmentalism, and people who are like, "Oh, we need to save the planet somehow." And then other people, you'll have this reaction towards that from modern Americans, conservative evangelicals that are like, "Ah, just let it burn," almost at some level. And you're like, "Whoa, hang on, maybe we actually do want to care for these things because they will be redeemed in the end." And somehow, the way they exist now points us towards that eternal reality, and they should then be valued for that. They're an icon, a symbol, or a sacrament of that eternal truth.
Yeah, and I think that like the best example of the point that you just made is the debates that we've been having in American society about Genesis for the last 150 years. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are incredibly important for the rest of the biblical narrative, and they were designed to explain God's intention in creating the world and human beings' role within that creation. But on the one hand, we've had the never-ending battle between the atheist or the skeptic scientist kind of people and the evangelicals, where the scientists say that this stuff can't be historical, and the evangelicals say, well, it must be read historically. And then even within Christian culture, there are debates over, is it 7 literal days? What does all that represent? The problem with both of those approaches to Genesis, though, is that they always completely miss the narrative point that the writer of Genesis is trying to make. I don't really care what your opinions are on all of that other stuff. I care that when you're reading Genesis, you get the main point, which is that human beings were created in God's image, so we all have intrinsic value. This world was originally good, and it was humans' desire to be like God that create all the problems that we're dealing with right now. That says a lot about our place in the world, and that can't just be reduced to a particular doctrinal or scientific proposition. And in a lot of ways, it provides us with much more meaning and a much more robust worldview than either the scientific or doctrinal approach to Genesis. But people are just so locked into that way of reading it that they can't appreciate what the writer is actually trying to communicate, which is so much more important and life-giving than those other questions. Not that those other questions aren't important, because they are, but they're of dramatic secondary or maybe even tertiary importance to what the writer of Genesis is trying to communicate narratively there.
Yeah, towards the myth, which Yuval Harari, when he talks about story, he sees story as fundamentally false. That's how come it's a story. But then when you and I are using it here and we're talking about story, we're talking about myth, we're like, no, it's true. It's a true story. And that the fact that it's true, that it points us towards that transcendent truth, is actually why then there's meaning packed into it, and why it's then able to give meaning to our endeavors here and now, and in our interactions with other human beings.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, I think two of the greatest Christian masters of doing this in the 20th century were obviously C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. Lewis, very famously, the man behind the Narnia series, and Tolkien, the man behind the legendary Lord of the Rings series. And I know that you have worked with both of those writers in your classes. So I want to get your perspective on both of them. Tolkien especially, because I think that there is no better modern fiction work that accurately encapsulates the entire Christian narrative than Lord of the Rings. I don't think you can do a better job of describing the Christian tradition than that book. So talk a little about Lewis and Tolkien, their influence on you, and how you use them in your classes.
Yeah, definitely. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. And I would say that Lord of the Rings, I think, is the best work, literary work of the 20th century. I think I'm going to throw that out there.
No pushback here.
Every time I read it, I'm just blown away all over again by the level of depth there. And as far as Tolkien's project with the Lord of the Rings, and the reason why I really enjoy talking about it and teaching it, is because we see it on the shelf, on the fantasy shelf, alongside something like Game of Thrones, or works by Neil Gaiman, and there's a tendency to think, okay, I can compare and contrast these because they're obviously trying to perform the same. They have the same authorial intent behind them. They're both narratives that are set in a fantastical world, and so it's totally understandable as to why people are wanting to compare and contrast those things. But at the end of the day, I think they're fundamentally different. And the reason why, like you're saying, there's so much meaning packed inside Lord of the Rings and inside Tolkien's work there is because he's doing so much more than simply telling a fantasy story. And it works at that level. That's the thing that's so awesome about it and fantastic, is that you read it and you're like, okay, this works. I'm moved by this. Right? And that being the hallmark of a story that works is, did it work on you emotionally? Did it work as a story, as a narrative? And in his case, it absolutely does. But one of the things that he was doing with Lord of the Rings, and this is why, like I said, I despair of ever trying to write anything. Just when I read Lord of the Rings, I'm like, okay, I could never write anything in a million years that would be nearly this holistically put together, because it's also an expression at some level of his academic career.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Where he's approaching texts and saying, okay, how do we understand texts? And how do we derive meaning from texts, from narrative? He was doing that with Beowulf in his academic career. And then, he was the one who really salvaged Beowulf from kind of the German deconstructionists in the 19th century, and saying, okay, we need to read this holistically. We need to read it as a narrative first and foremost before we start dissecting it to try to understand its bits and pieces. And so people were always waiting for him to write the big academic magnum opus. And then he writes Lord of the Rings, and the academic community for the next 80 years thought, or they were like, "This, what is this? You've been spending your time writing children's fiction. What on earth have you been doing with your time?" And what's, when he was talking about his work with the Silmarillion and with Lord of the Rings, and he said, I wanted to write a myth for England. And he could have written a didactic tome that no one would have read about how myth is formed. But instead, he decided to actually enter into and participate in the creative endeavor of demonstrating how myth is made by subcreating one, by creating one himself, and saying, okay, here's a story that I have in some ways that I've used in an attempt to actually encapsulate how myth is formed in such a way that it then gives us meaning. And again, that's why I think Lord of the Rings will be with us 1,000 years from now, because it is so meaningful. And you read it and you're like, okay, my goodness, why is this so moving? And it's because he actually understands how myth and legend is formed and is able to then instill all of that within the text. And so when you read Lord of the Rings, it's not simply within his mind. He's not seeing it purely as the product of his own authorial intent, right? There's Frodo, there's Bilbo, there's Pippin, and then there are glosses that are being put into the text. There are so many authors that he has baked into the narrative there. I think this is how texts are formed. And he understood that from working with things like Beowulf, where, right, in Beowulf you have multiple copyists, multiple authors. You have a text that is ultimately derived from an oral tradition, and how many years had it taken for that to be assembled before it was eventually ever written down. And so what you have within Lord of the Rings that he has at some level artificially created as part of his authorial intent is many hands, many authors creating a single narrative. And that's all baked into Lord of the Rings there. And so when we see that and are able to actually appreciate it as a final text, it's like, oh, this is how texts are formed. Anytime you're going and reading a medieval work, this is how they were created.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize this too, but both C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien were medieval scholars. Like they were professional medievalists, and Tolkien, I know, had a specialization in linguistics in particular, and so they were both brilliant academics in their own right. Now, with like the Chronicles of Narnia series, we just finished reading it with my daughter. it's a little more obvious that it's Christian narrative because obviously the Aslan is Jesus, and he makes that claim within the text itself. So it's easy to see those resonances there in the text. It's a little bit more subtle with Lord of the Rings, but from your perspective, what would you say are the most significant Christian themes that Tolkien embedded in Lord of the Rings? And I also think before I let you answer that too, it's important to remember that Tolkien was a self-described anarchist. So he tended to look at political and human power in the same way that we do, which is just another very interesting layer to that story. So what, from a Christian perspective, maybe even like a libertarian or a freedom-oriented perspective, would you say the major themes are in Lord of the Rings?
Yeah, well, so much of it is wrapped around questions of death, and then the hunger on the part of humanity for either a release from death, or people attempting to, and this includes both in his world, humans and elves, in an endeavor to either acquire power or to preserve things that are not given to them for their own things that have not been granted to them. And he has fascinating interplay throughout the texts on these questions between mastery and dominion over goods, over people, over realms, and definitely in the Silmarillion as well, we see this again and again and again happening, where there's a desire to preserve things that are to preserve things outside of their natural ends, or to acquire or accumulate power in a way that's contrary to how you've been naturally designed. And in Lord of the Rings, that's a huge theme around the question of the ring, which is why the ring doesn't actually grant life at the end of the day. It artificially preserves it and stretches it out, because it's saying, Tolkien's looking at it, and within this cosmos, within this world, saying you've not been granted that kind of power to be able to extend your life beyond this certain limited number of years here. And any attempt to do so will be cutting against the grain of reality and against the fabric of your own existence. And so any attempt to break free from that will ultimately result in a sort of in a deconstruction of your own humanity, or whatever makes you, whether that's you as a human being or you as an elf. So that's a huge theme. And yeah, and your question about power and seeing that throughout their dominion and control beyond that which has been allotted to you as a human being. And then the ultimate destruction, and I had mentioned earlier, the not just the destruction of the things that you love, but also the deconstruction of your own humanity in pursuit of that.
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful answer to that question. Well, I want to ask you, we got just a couple minutes left here. You work with the George Buchanan Forum, and in fact, you were their executive director. So I want to give you a little chance to talk to my audience about that, because from what I've read and from what we've discussed outside of the show, it seems like the George Buchanan Forum does a really great job of trying to incorporate all of these different elements that we've been discussing today into that organization. So just talk to us a little bit about what it is and the work you do for them.
Yeah. The George Buchanan Forum was created, like I had mentioned to you earlier, that we're sort of in the heart of Christian nationalist country. And one of the things that we really wanted to be able to do was to be able to talk to that community. And also, since these issues are very prescient across the country and across the world even today, to be able to speak to those, move the Overton window in the discussion that we're having around these topics, and either be able to say, hey, this is a topic that's not being addressed. Can we speak to that? Or say, this is a topic that perhaps is being presented in a very limited manner. We're given, a very narrow 3x5 card of allowable opinion on this topic.
There you go. I love it.
and we would like to expand that and present maybe some alternative perspectives on that issue. George Buchanan, he was a Scots reformer, but he was very much a polymath, where he was a poet. He was writing literature. He was writing theology. He was writing history, and we wanted to be able to incorporate all of that into a sort of holistic discussion around the things and the topics that people are finding meaningful today. And like I said, being able to speak to those and have sort of a record of these conversations in the hopes that maybe they would be helpful for people either here locally or outside of our community.
Yeah, well, I love it, man. I think this conversation's been a pretty good foretaste of the things that people can expect from the Buchanan Forum here. The last question I want to ask you, changing gears entirely, we're coming up on the 2024 election, and it's funny because I sent you the questions that I was going to go through today last week, and my note here on the page says 2024 elections: Trump, Biden, RFK, and Oliver. Obviously, Joe Biden's not running for president anymore, so by the time this episode comes out in a couple weeks, who knows? Who knows what's going to happen? And obviously, Trump almost got shot 2 weeks ago. So who knows what's going to happen? But we're sitting in July. It's very precarious to make predictions about an election, especially one that's probably going to be fairly chaotic. But what do you think's going to happen? I know that from my own perspective, I think that RFK is currently getting the Ron Paul treatment, and that I don't think that the media is covering him. And he probably actually has a little bit more support than the news and the polls are letting on. So I think that when it actually comes to election day in November, that might be a major factor that people don't take into consideration. Chase Oliver's campaign doesn't seem to be going anywhere just because he's not getting total support from the Libertarian Party, but it does seem like his platform will appeal more towards left-leaning libertarians, and it might peel some more votes away from Harris. Will Harris be the nominee for the Democrats? Will Trump make it? What are your thoughts on what's going to happen come November?
Yeah, look into the crystal ball and
Right.
and forecast.
Who is the CIA going to pick to be our next president?
Yeah, that definitely did occur to me. Thinking about how history unfolds, because as we were mentioning with economics, it's not simply machinery moving inevitably towards a conclusion. So the ability for governments to create distractions and I'm reminded of there was a quote from Metropolitan of Kiev who said that politicians want us to forget about eternity and the salvation of our souls. And they want us to be preoccupied with endless political squabbles. At some level, so much of this is performative distraction. And so your joke about the CIA, I think when you look at the history of the Cold War and realize that so much of national politics throughout the world has just been that the CIA or foreign governments stepping in and tampering with things and distracting people, and their ability to do that, and our ability then to be distracted by whatever the new hot thing is that they're going to throw at us, whether that's COVID, and which isn't to say that these aren't real issues. Questions around COVID or Black Lives Matter, when all of a sudden we're going to have, people protesting, and how hard is it for the government to then hire a whole bunch of actors to then, burn things in the streets and then get everybody all worked up about that. I guess I would hesitate to make forecasts because of that ability that has historically been demonstrated over the last 80 years for governments to be able to step in. And, who knows what would happen if somehow we're orchestrated into a conflict with Iran or China or Russia. And what would that do to the election? I don't know. I don't put anything beyond these government institutions. I believe they're perfectly capable of any number of indescribable evils. So I wouldn't put anything past them. But what they feel that they can actually get away with, I don't know, and I don't know if that would limit them.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I think that what I've been saying for a very long time, that I think that whatever happens, it's probably not going to be pretty, and there are going to be a lot of people that are very angry and think it's illegitimate at the end of the day. So you know what, I'll have to have you back on sometime in the spring, and we'll talk about the fallout of the election and see what we think about it. See if any of our predictions came to pass here. But George, man, it's been great getting to meet you today and talk to you. This has been a lot of fun. Before I let you go, where can people find your work and Kepler and the George Buchanan Forum? Just plug all your stuff.
So I'll share stuff on Twitter. I'm on there at J.R.R. Harrell. Kepler.education is the Kepler site. And I have a profile on there. So people, if they're interested in courses, they can look that up. And then the George Buchanan Forum is over at tgbf.org. And you can access any of their materials either through podcast format on YouTube, wherever you like to get your media there. I would definitely love it if people checked any of that out and interacted or gave us information on things that they'd like to hear and topics that they'd like to see discussed.
That sounds great. Well, George, thank you so much for coming on the show today, man.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been fantastic.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.